Hi, this is Mark Orr. I'm here with the next Mission Critical podcast. Today we're focusing explicitly on the Assembli platform. The Assembli platform is a key part of our overall strategy to create a whole new breakthrough environment, a breakthrough system that will enable the global Christian community, including you, to work together better at changing the world, changing your world and changing the world in big ways as well as we work together with each other. Now, a part of Assembli, a big part of Assembli, is the 15 blocks that we will get into over the next few weeks as we do a deep dive into each individual block. But first, you're probably asking, what's a block? So I'm going to explain that in the next few minutes, and we're going to go through some of the fundamental reasons why we believe BlockPlay is really the key to why Assembli will work. So let's back up a bit and start at the beginning. First of all, we believe that Assembli is what we would call a game changer. It's going to change the way that we work as a Christian community, the way we relate, and the way we care about our world. So it's not just a game changer, but it's a world changer. Now, why do we need that? Well, we've had a number of podcasts that have already focused on some of those reasons. But very briefly, the ability for us to work together is limited by the kind of platforms that we use. And in a complex world like we are in today, we are lacking the kind of tools, the kind of structures that will enable us to efficiently and effectively actually work together. We're also lacking things, structures, and mechanisms and processes that will help normal, average people change their communities. And that's where Assembli comes in and is unique, because Assembli is a platform that will both scale up and scale down. It will scale down to help any individual run projects and connect with resources and so on that will help them change their own neighborhoods. But it will also link all of those pieces together to enable Assembli to help all of us tackle some of the biggest, most challenging issues in the world. Assembli, you might still be thinking, okay, yes, that's what it does, but what is it? Well, the simplest way to answer that is that it's an app. But as you know, apps on your phone and on your computer these days are really entire operating systems in themselves almost. And now that we're being hit with concepts like metaverse and artificial intelligence and so on, an app is really far more complex. And that's a beautiful thing too, because we live in an age when we have tools available to us, incredible tools available to us that we have not begun to consider how to use effectively in the Christian community. So yes, Assembli is an app, but it's an app that will use whatever we are able to bring into it that is available in terms of technology, models, data, and so on, that will enable us to work better together. I mentioned the word metaverse. Metaverse is a concept some of you already know quite a bit about, and the rest of us are sort of waiting for somebody out there to figure it out so we know what to do with it and how it works. The reality is that for those of us who are parents, our kids are already playing with different metaverses on their computers, Roblox and so on. There's many different sort of like worlds that are created where a lot of interaction can happen. Now, one of my concerns is that when we look at the concept of metaverse, it doesn't have to be necessarily, but it tends to give us the idea that people are removing themselves from reality in order to get into another world. So we could call it escapism, or we could call it doing things that are really out of touch with reality. And that might be the case with a lot of metaverses that are being developed out there. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the kind of metaverse that actually connects us even more closely with reality and with people so that we can work together and to address real world issues. Now, there are aspects of the metaverse that are interesting and that can help us really understand how to work together better. And some of those are revolved around this idea of representation, around avatars and tokens, which are used to represent the real world in an artificial world. Okay, and some of that is key to what we're talking about today. Another word that's a little bit older, but I think is really valuable and helps us understand this too, is the word ecosystem. Ecosystem comes from nature. It's how the balance of nature works together in a beautiful way. It's like a symphony of nature. And that system works because all the pieces are doing their part. And it brings life. It's organic life coming together in diversity, yet in harmony. And in many ways, that's what we also want to see, is that the global church that God has called us to be, He's called us to be a kingdom. He's called us to be a people of peace, a channel of blessing. And He's called us to do that locally and globally as we work together. But we have not had the systems in place that actually enable us to do that. Let me go back to a couple of significant changes that have happened throughout history. Just as an example, there's many of them. One of them that was used in the New Testament times was the whole Roman system. The Romans were an oppressive empire that was seen as something that people wanted to get rid of. But we do have them to thank for the Roman roads, the ways that people could get around between countries in the Mediterranean area far quicker than they could in the past. The other thing that happened in those days was the Greek language, which evolved over time, but it created a common way of communicating. And the Apostle Paul and others of that day used those, we could call them technologies in a sense, or systems, to actually accelerate the spread of the gospel. Okay? If you jump ahead, I don't know, 1,500 years or so, you come to a time when the Bible was primarily in Latin, translated into Latin around AD 1500, and there were just a few copies that the priests would read. And then came along an invention called the Gutenberg press, and suddenly the Bible could be mass-produced so that everybody, or at least many people, could have a copy. And that changed a lot of things. And we're still working on that through the work of many good people who are translating the Bible into yet more and more languages so that people can have God's Word in their native tongue. That's an important innovation that happened. Now, I believe that today we're in a time when we have the technology available to us to create an entirely new way of working together far more effectively. The sad thing is, for some reason, we're not opening our eyes up to it. We're not seeing it. And so we're running the risk of going an entire generation without coming close at all to taking advantage of the tools that we have available to us. So I see Assembli as an attempt to be a platform, along with other things, of course, that God uses along the way, to create a way for us to come far closer to being the people of the way, to being God's people who live in a way that has an impact in every neighborhood in the world. Now, to do anything that lasts, we need to work together, right? There's things we can do by ourselves, but many of the things that we want to do and see in our neighborhoods and across the world, we need each other for those things. We need people with ideas. We need people with resources. We need people with communication skills. We need many different types of talents to come together. And the problem is that in the past, we've done that primarily either by trying to do it ourselves or by starting organizations. And God has used the whole concept of organizations to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, to do many, many good things that we have done in the name of Jesus. That in itself was an innovation. If you go back to William Carey's day about 250 years ago, William Carey was part of a time when he was a pastor, a Baptist pastor in England, part of a Baptist church. And he was in a time when there were no parachurch organizations, that basically anything that was done in the name of Jesus was done through the structure of the church. And he said, hey, you know what? We're too ingrown here. We're existing for ourselves rather than going out. So he proposed that a different type of organization be set up. Initially, he was shut down. He was ridiculed for that idea, but he didn't quit. He kept moving, and he started what's considered one of the first modern style parachurch organizations that the world ever saw. And God used that. There was a new paradigm, a new way of thinking. Today we're in a place where we need a new kind of structure. One that, at least for a time, will work with existing traditional structures, but I believe that over time will become the dominant way that we work together. Not for all times, because God brings along new things in new generations. But I believe that for today's generation, and probably the next, we need something that looks similar to Assembli to actually mobilize us to a far greater extent than we're mobilized right now. I believe we're in a time of great hope when we can do this. Now, I'm digressing a bit, but let's get back to what Assembli is. It's a metaverse, it's an ecosystem, it's an app. So in very practical terms, it's going to be something that resides on your phone or on your computer. And it's going to be your link, your way of engaging with real people and real resources to change your community, your nation, your world. Now, for this to work, you're saying, oh, come on, how can an app do that? One app, there's many apps out there and they all have their little part to play. But how can one app be part of this? Well, I'm not suggesting you're going to use just one app. Of course not. You're going to use whatever you have available to make the job easier. But what we're lacking is a kind of app that connects all the different pieces in a way that can do what traditional organizations do, that can do what traditional teams do, that can do what traditional churches even do to some degree. I'm not saying this becomes the church, but it can become a gathering place, and ultimately that's what the church is. It's a gathering of the people to worship God and serve and learn from one another and equip each other. And that's what this can do. At the core of this, so what I'm going to introduce today is a sort of like an engine, a model, the architecture at the very heart of Assembli that makes this work. Okay? It's a concept called BlockPlay. And it's really, if you take a little bit of time, it's not that hard to understand. But I think if you do take some time to understand it, it starts to unlock in your mind the potential for Assembli, and you'll start to dream and see what it can do. It's really an operating system in itself, something that can enable many other applications and projects and relationships to thrive as we work together. So BlockPlay is, you might hear some tinkering here because if you're on the video version, I'm holding some pieces of Duplo here, which my kids play with. And if you're on the audio version of this, you might hear a little bit of this happening, and that's because I'm holding some of these pieces. What I have in front of me are 15 pieces. These 15 pieces are in three categories. There's what we call the structure pieces. There's 5 of those. Any kind of structure. Now stop and think about that for a minute. Is it a team? Is it a family? Is it a church? Is it a group? Is it a chat? Is it an organization? Is it a network? Is it a consortium? Is it a course, a university? Any structure that you can imagine, some tiny little club that you meet in the backyard to talk about your neighborhood, or something big and global that is highly complex. Any structure that you might need to give shape to the vision or ideas that God has given you can be represented by one of these 5 structure blocks. Okay? Let me go on to the second category. There's 5 blocks also. We have it here represented by the green blocks on my table. These are resource blocks. You can have an idea and you can have a structure for that idea, but without resources, we don't go very far with it, do we? And anywhere you go, in any church, any neighborhood, any project, any mission trip, you're always finding people that are struggling with the resource part of their project. Where do we get the funding? Where do we get the material? Where do we get the information that we need for this project? We want to answer that and address that through these 5 blocks. I believe that any resource that you or your organization or your church or your company need to connect to the ideas you have can be represented by one of these 5 blocks. It's things like skills, any kind of skill or talent that anyone has that might be useful, knowledge, materials, funding, and relationships. Relationships is about who you know. It's connections. Do you know somebody that can help with this? Do you know somebody who might have knowledge or wisdom about this particular topic? Do you know someone down the street, or do you know someone over in Singapore that might be able to help me with something that I need to do over there? Those 5 resource blocks enable and assist the ideas that can be represented by the structures. Okay. Lastly, we have 5 blocks that are all about story or media. Initially, when we were developing this concept, we didn't have those, but we thought, it's one thing to start an idea, to connect resources to it and implement it. But what about celebrating it? What about telling the story? What about mobilizing other people to it? What about multiplying those effects? Those are all stories and narratives and celebrations that need to happen and need to be told. And so we created 5 blocks that are specific for that purpose. We have the content blocks, which is the most common one, and that's where you have files, audio and video and so on, that can each be represented by a block in Assembli. But how do you organize those? So then we have 2 or 3 ways of doing that. One is collections, which are like mini libraries on a particular topic. And we have channels, which are many of you in social media very familiar with that. Themed collections, but they're very dynamic and changing all the time. Then we have one that's called an influencer. Now this is so that a person who sees themselves in a sense as a champion, as a promoter of something, can actually have a way of engaging within the Assembli platform and bring attention to projects and causes and themes that they really feel strongly about. And lastly, I'll mention the media network. Media network is really a way of collecting all of those other things into a strategy that's broader and that makes sense. Now, any of these can be done at a tiny scale. For example, you can have an entire media network just inside of one church, or you could have a media network that is global. It's like a CNN or a BBC. Okay? So these are 15 blocks that can represent anything and everything that you or me or anyone else needs to do to change the world. Okay? If you can come up with anything that is important and needs to be represented but is not represented by one of these blocks, we want to hear from you. We want you to come up and say, hey, you're missing something. Most likely I'll tell you, yes, that fits under here because these will be developed in many different ways with subcategories, but you might come up with something that we need to add. So I welcome very much your input in that area. Now, 15 blocks. These are the building tools. There might be some other words that help you, relate to it a bit more. These can be called tokens. In some metaverses, they're called tokens. They could be avatars almost. They're elements, profiles of these different pieces that live within the Assembli ecosystem. Okay? Now, there's probably a lot of questions running through your head right now. Maybe you need to sort of stop this recording, go back to the beginning and start over again. That's okay. Do that as many times as you need to. You're not going to understand assembly until you listen to all the podcasts and maybe go back and listen to them again. Now, the average person isn't going to do that. But we're not looking for average people in this movement. We're not looking for average people to come and participate in assembly. We're looking for people who are on the fringes, perhaps, who are done with mediocrity, who see the lack of innovation, the lack of energy, the lack of interesting ideas around us to actually make a difference in our world. There's so much of hopelessness, of despairing, and then that eventually just turns into apathy and lethargy. If you're one of those people who says, that doesn't make sense, that's not right, that's who we're looking for. And if you are that kind of person, then you're going to take some time to listen to these podcasts, and you're going to start to think and apply it to your own situation. Hey, I could do this or that with those things. The idea here, just before I go on to the 5 characteristics of these blocks, we're trying to create a platform that enables average people to do extraordinary things. In the traditional world, you go through school, you're sent to a higher school, a university, a college, you get some skills, maybe you get a degree, you join an organization or a company, you work hard to climb the ladder. And so many people in that process, in that journey, feel frustrated, feel trapped, feel like they have ideas and suggestions and energy and passion for something. But if it doesn't quite align with the organization that is giving them their check, their pay, then they don't have an opportunity to do much about it. What we're creating here is something so that every individual, from teenagers with no degrees to CEOs of large organizations, anyone can put shape and implement the things that God is putting on their heart without starting a formal organization. All the tools are available to you right here. Okay? Now that doesn't mean we're not organized. The beauty of Assembli is that all of this is going to fit together, and you'll see that in the next few minutes and in the next few podcasts. Okay? So I hope that causes you maybe to continue to listen, because this is about you. No matter how uneducated or how educated or how little or big an organization you're a part of, or what country you're a part of, or how rich or poor you are, this is for you, and it can help you do what God wants you to do. Now, I've explained a little bit about BlockPlay already. Now, I have 15 blocks in front of me right now. 5, 5, and 5. 3 different categories which I've explained. Now, I can do some things with these blocks. I can start a project block, and I can connect it to a knowledge block so that somebody with a knowledge contribution can come in, and a couple of others, and I can build something small. Okay? Now imagine if billions of blocks were dumped in a huge mound, in a big pile in a stadium, and every one of those blocks represented a talent or an idea, a person with knowledge, some money, and so forth. Imagine that all of those blocks represented something in the real world, and that somehow we could connect all of those together, that we could intelligently connect them together and bring them to life and let them go to create change in the world. That's what we're talking about. So it can scale so that everyone can connect to everyone else. Now I'm jumping ahead of myself a bit here because I'm excited about that interconnected aspect of this. What's characteristic number 1? First of all, what I call the representative power of blocks. Okay? Everything in the real world, in the physical world, in the world that you live in, can be represented by one of these blocks. All right? So if you have a skill as an accountant, you can start a block that is your accounting block. It represents you and your accounting skill. If you have some money and that's your main way of contributing to the world, you can create a block that is specific about money and the particular thing or desire that you want that money to be used for. And that can be an individual block. You can start a block that is a network because you've created a small network somewhere. And so you create a block that represents that network. Okay? So anything can be represented by a block. So the way to play, let's say, and I don't want to make light of this is serious business, but it can also be fun. The way to play this game, the way to enter into it, and to offer what you are into this beautiful journey that we're going to travel together is to start a block that represents the talents and the resources and the ideas and the abilities that you have. Okay? So the blocks are representative. They're the way that you engage with others. Now, the second thing I'll mention is what I call ownership permanence. Okay? If you start a block, no matter where that block is used, anywhere on the ecosystem, anywhere in the metaverse, no matter where that block is used, no matter what else it's connected to or what project or network or distant need it's responding to, it still belongs to you. It still belongs to you. It's yours. That's something God gave you. You contribute it, but it's still yours. Okay? And that's important because we're not just giving something away without the responsibility and the stewardship of it. Okay? Now, in some cases, yes, it finishes its work, and then you can start a new block. Okay? But as long as it exists, it's yours. All right? And we're going to touch on another aspect of that in a few minutes. So ownership permanence is a second characteristic. The third is what I call block connectability. Okay? Very simple. That one's an easy one to understand. I'm looking at my Duplo here, or Lego, or other kinds of building blocks. Every single block can connect to any other block. Every single block can connect to another block. Okay? In Assembli, in this ecosystem, your block can connect to virtually any other block in the entire system. All right? It can connect to others. It can connect to your own. You can create your own and connect them all together into a project or an initiative that makes sense. Or you can connect with other people. So the beautiful thing here, just imagine the power of this. You start a block, and often we think, okay, now, but I'm missing this. But I'm only good at one skill. But I have the ideas, but I don't have the money. A lot of people with money say, I have the money, but I don't have the ideas. The beautiful thing is that the missing components, the missing blocks, the missing building blocks to what you want to do very likely have already been created by someone else, somewhere else in your neighborhood, somewhere else in your nation, somewhere else in the world. You don't have to necessarily recreate it. In fact, most of the time, you probably do not need to recreate or to create something to fill a missing gap in your plan or your strategy. You can already find it. Okay? Now, in our old way of doing things, what we do is build teams. So we have to find a bunch of people that sort of agree to a purpose, and we try to put them together. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. We sort of have to take the whole person or not at all. In Assembli, we can invite the aspect of another person, represented by a particular block, to participate. And so you or that other person can participate in multiple ways, connect to multiple other structures and initiatives, and help in multiple ways. You're not limited to one way or to doing it one at a time. All right? So this block connectivity, if you start to let it go crazy in your mind, can unleash us to do so many more things in such a better way, to connect rare needs with rare resources, because we can pinpoint it and the algorithms can connect them beautifully. Let's move on to number 4. Limitless blocks. That's another characteristic, or what a friend of mine just said. Mark, that you're probably talking about protocols here. Here's protocols that define how these elements in the world work together. Okay, and we can do it efficiently and at scale because of the technology we have. So, what do I mean by limitless blocks? Well, pretty much says it itself. You can start as many blocks as you want. Now you might say, okay, that's fine. I'll start a few blocks. But let's dig into it just a little bit. Let's say you're an accountant, and so you start a skill block as an accountant. But most people are more than one thing. You're also, when you go home, you love to cook. And maybe you're a chef. So you can start another block that is you as a chef. And you can contribute that ability you have. And you might be a third or a fourth thing. And each ability can be connected to different things in different ways wherever the need is. Or you might be a chef one summer, and then the next summer you want to volunteer as an accountant. Or you want to go and build a church with somebody. There's unlimited amount of blocks that you can build, as long as you fulfill the requirements for each particular block. All right? So we don't want to see an individual as one sort of monolithic, single thing. No person is one single thing. God has made people in themselves diverse abilities, diverse interests, and those all matter. And we want to pay attention to those. So the block system in Assembli can reflect that about people. All right? Let's go on to number 5, and then we'll do a quick review. Number 5 is blocks are reusable. I've already mentioned this to some degree. What do I mean by that? I mean, you can create a block that's like a content block, but it can be used over and over again in any number, maybe 3 or 4, or maybe 5,000 or 6,000 different projects and organizations and so on. Just like you can share a file on the internet and 1,000 people can link to it. In Assembli, an unlimited number of links and relationships can happen between blocks. When we connect the blocks together, that's a link or a relationship. Now, these relationships can happen in any direction between any two blocks, unlimited number of times. All right? That creates incredible power. That means that we don't have to recreate something. Sometimes we have to, but often we don't have to recreate it. We simply have to link to it and connect to it. All right? Now, there will be all kinds of, we won't get into this today, but there's all kinds of tools that will help this all work safely and efficiently. For example, when an owner of another block says, my block wants to connect to your block, you can say yes or no to that. You control whether that happens. No one's going to do it without your permission. The same when you request to participate in another block, they have to approve of that. Okay, so it takes 2 people to approve a relationship, then the relationship is done. All right, and it can be broken if there's a need for it to be broken in the future. So blocks are reusable, blocks are limitless, blocks are connectable. Every block connects to each other. When you create a block, you continue to own it until either its purpose or use has been completed and fulfilled, or in some cases, you may want to transfer ownership of that block to another. Quick example of that is if you start a virtual organization on Assembli, one of our structure blocks is an organization block. So you'll start an organization, and maybe it evolves and you work with it for a number of years. You connect it to thousands of other blocks and you do what it was meant to do, and then you decide, it's time to pass this on to a younger leader. And then you don't have to stop and recreate that whole organization. You can pass ownership of that block on to somebody else. All right? So these are 5 characteristics, and there's others that we'll pick up along the way that start to give you a hint of the power of how blocks can work together. Okay? In the next 15 podcasts, we're actually going to take time to go into each single block. All right? Let me just, as a teaser, give you an example of that. The first structure block is what we call groups. All right? Groups is any limited, smaller group of people, usually that could fit in a building or a room or a classroom or something like that. A group has a specific function and it has a limited amount of people. Okay? There's all kinds of applications for groups. You could start a group that is a standalone group. It exists not to be linked up with others. It just exists. It could be a prayer group. It could be a team. It could be a think tank, a brainstorm kind of group of people. It could be absolutely any kind of group you can imagine. A social group, a discussion group, and so on. There'll be a number of different types of groups, so basically templates or processes that a group owner can choose when they start a group. And those tools that come with that process will help that group do what you want it to do. If it's a prayer process, then there will be ways of collecting and praying for and following up on and celebrating and thanking God for answers to prayer. If it's a team, there'll be ways of managing and delegating and holding team members accountable to tasks and so on. So there'll be many different kinds of groups, okay? And remember that every group block can be connected to something else, to many other things. So a group might be a team of engineers who volunteer their services once a year to a project that needs their skills. And so that group connects to a project, does the job, and then another year connects to a different project or a network and so forth. And in the group, you can connect different kinds of resources, people with knowledge and money to support the group and so forth. All kinds of things that can be done through groups. So we're going to take probably about half an hour just to explore groups, and we'll do that one at a time through all the groups, all the 15 blocks in Assembli. On top of this, on top of BlockPlay is the engine. There will be interfaces, dashboards, and stuff that make it look cool, easy to use, friendly, as intuitive as we can make it, and a lot of fun. So there'll be little places where we can gamify this, make it sort of fun, maybe a tiny bit of friendly competition, celebrate things together, and tackle the world's problems and your neighborhood's problems together. We can do this. We can do far, far better than we are doing today in the world. And I believe Assembli gives us some ideas of how we can be better. So thank you for listening. We're going to close it up for now, and we invite you back for our first discussion on a specific block, and that's going to be the block about groups. Thank you for listening. If you haven't joined up for Assembli yet, and so that you can express your support for this movement and for the building of the app, and just track along and get the updates and so on, please do at assembli.net. Thank you for listening.